More than 400 years ago, over 100 men, women, and children built what they hoped would become England's first permanent colony in the New World. They had food, they had homes, they had hope. Then, without a single battle, without a single known grave, without a single confirmed survivor, they disappeared. When rescuers finally arrived years later, the entire settlement stood silent. No bodies, no signs of violence, no desperate messages. Only one mysterious word carved into a tree, a word that has haunted historians for centuries. Croton. Who carved it? Why was it left behind? And what really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Tonight, we retrace every known clue, every historical document, and every theory in one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The Atlantic Ocean was merciless in the late 16th century. Its towering waves swallowed ships without warning. Its storms erased carefully plotted courses, and its endless horizon concealed lands that European kingdoms barely understood. Yet for England, those dangerous waters represented something greater than fear. They represented opportunity. By the 1580s, Spain had become the dominant global empire. Its ships returned from the Americas carrying unimaginable wealth, gold, silver, precious stones, and stories of vast territories waiting to be claimed. Queen Elizabeth I knew that if England wished to challenge Spanish power, it needed colonies of its own. Establishing a permanent settlement in North America was no longer simply an adventure. It had become a matter of national ambition. The man determined to make that vision a reality was Sir Walter Raleigh. A favorite of the Queen, Raleigh was an explorer, soldier, entrepreneur, and dreamer. Although he would never personally set foot in the colony that bore his hopes, he financed the expeditions that would attempt to create England's first permanent foothold in the New World. His chosen destination lay along the coast of what is now North Carolina on an island called Roanoke. Early reports described the region as promising. Thick forests stretched for miles. Rivers teemed with fish. Wildlife appeared abundant. The climate seemed far gentler than many expected. To English eyes, the land looked capable of supporting farms, villages, and eventually entire towns. The first exploratory missions returned with encouraging accounts. They also brought back two Native American men, Manteo and Wanchese, who traveled to England and became living proof that communication between cultures might be possible. Their presence fascinated English society. Manteo, in particular, proved remarkably curious and willing to learn the English language. He would later become one of the colony's most important intermediaries. Encouraged by these early successes, England launched its first attempt at settlement in 1585. That expedition struggled almost immediately. Food supplies dwindled. Relations with some neighboring tribes deteriorated after misunderstandings and acts of violence. Disease spread. The colonists found themselves completely dependent on supply ships arriving from across an ocean thousands of miles wide. When Sir Francis Drake unexpectedly reached the struggling settlement after attacking Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, many colonists chose to abandon Roanoke and return home. The first attempt had failed. But failure did not destroy Raleigh's vision. If anything, it strengthened his determination. England still needed a colony. The second expedition would be different. Instead of soldiers seeking temporary occupation, this time entire families would cross the Atlantic. Men would bring wives. Parents would bring children. Craftsmen, farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers would travel together with the intention of building not merely a military outpost, but a permanent English community. The leader chosen for this ambitious mission was John White. Unlike many explorers of his era, White possessed unusual talents. He was both an artist and a careful observer. During earlier voyages, he had created remarkably detailed watercolor paintings depicting Native American villages, local wildlife, and the landscape itself. Those illustrations remain among the most valuable visual records of the region before large-scale European colonization transformed it forever. John White understood that survival required more than courage. It required diplomacy, planning, and patience. He hoped peaceful relationships with local tribes could succeed where previous hostility had failed. In the spring of 1587, approximately 115 colonists boarded ships bound for Roanoke. Among them were entire families chasing dreams that would forever change their lives. They carried tools, seeds, livestock, household goods, weapons for protection, religious books, and enough hope to outweigh every fear they carried onto the decks. Few could have imagined they were sailing toward one of history's greatest mysteries. The Atlantic crossing itself tested every passenger. Weeks passed beneath violent storms and suffocating heat. Fresh water became scarce. Food spoiled. Illness spread easily in the cramped quarters below deck. Children cried through endless nights as waves slammed against the wooden hulls. Every sunrise was greeted with relief, simply because it meant the ships had survived another night. When land finally appeared on the horizon, cheers erupted across the vessels. America, the shoreline looked almost untouched. Dense forests reached nearly to the water's edge. Endless marshes shimmered beneath the summer sun. Birds circled overhead while unfamiliar sounds drifted from deep within the trees. To many aboard, the continent appeared both beautiful and intimidating. Yet trouble emerged almost immediately. The expedition's navigator refused to carry the settlers farther into Chesapeake Bay, where the colony had originally been intended to relocate. Instead, he insisted on leaving them once again at Roanoke Island, the site of the earlier failed settlement. Whether this decision resulted from impatience, poor judgment, or hidden motives remains debated by historians. Whatever the reason, it changed everything. The colonists unloaded their supplies and watched as the ships that had brought them across the Atlantic slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. The silence that followed must have been overwhelming. There was no turning back. England now existed only as a memory across thousands of miles of ocean. Ahead lay dense forests, unfamiliar neighbors, uncertain harvests, and a future entirely dependent upon their own resilience. Among the settlers was John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare. She was pregnant. Only days after arriving on August 18, 1587, she gave birth to a baby girl. The child received the name Virginia Dare. She became the first English child known to have been born in North America. For the exhausted colonists, her birth felt like a sign of hope, a new generation, a permanent beginning, a future worth fighting for. No one standing beside that tiny infant could possibly know that within only a few years, not one member of that settlement would remain where they stood. Their homes would still exist. Their belongings would largely disappear. Their names would survive, but the people themselves would vanish so completely that more than 4 centuries later, historians are still searching for answers. The first weeks at Roanoke were consumed by urgency. Every hour mattered. Before the coming winter, the settlers needed shelter, fresh water, reliable food supplies, and some understanding of the unfamiliar world surrounding them. There was little time to celebrate Virginia Dare's birth. Survival came first. The abandoned remains of the earlier English settlement offered only limited help. Some structures could be repaired, but years of exposure had allowed nature to reclaim much of the colony. Roofs had collapsed. Wooden walls had begun to rot. Weeds pushed through abandoned pathways. The settlement looked less like a village and more like a forgotten memory. Men immediately began cutting timber from nearby forests. Carpenters rebuilt homes while laborers reinforced defensive barriers around the settlement. Women organized food stores, cared for children, cooked communal meals, washed clothing, and preserved every useful item brought across the Atlantic. Everyone worked from sunrise until darkness made further labor impossible. Although the colonists possessed tools unfamiliar to many native communities, they quickly discovered that ire alone could not guarantee survival. They knew almost nothing about the local environment, which plants were safe to eat, which rivers remained fresh throughout the year, which fish migrated during different seasons. When should crops be planted in this unfamiliar climate? These were questions no English farming experience could answer. For those answers, they needed the knowledge of the people who had lived there for generations. Fortunately, one familiar face remained an invaluable ally. Coe, having traveled to England years earlier, Manteo understood both cultures better than almost anyone alive. He spoke English, knew many of the settlers personally, and believed peaceful cooperation remained possible despite earlier conflicts. His loyalty proved extraordinary. Without Manteo acting as interpreter and guide, the colony's chances of survival would have been dramatically lower. Yet while one friendship endured, many others had already been destroyed. The violence surrounding the failed 1585 settlement had left deep scars. During that earlier expedition, misunderstandings, stolen supplies, and retaliatory attacks had poisoned relationships with several Algonquian-speaking communities. Some tribal leaders no longer viewed English settlers as curious newcomers. They viewed them as dangerous intruders. John White understood the fragile situation better than most. He urged restraint whenever possible, knowing that another cycle of violence could doom the colony before its first harvest. Still, trust was difficult to rebuild. Both sides carried memories. Both sides feared betrayal. Small trading exchanges continued in certain areas. Corn, fish, and local knowledge could sometimes be exchanged for metal tools, beads, knives, or cloth. But every meeting carried uncertainty. A single misunderstanding could ignite conflict. Meanwhile, another enemy silently threatened everyone. Food, the supplies brought from England, were never intended to last indefinitely. Salted meat spoiled faster than expected in the humid climate. Flour attracted insects. Fresh produce disappeared within weeks. Livestock remained limited. Hunting parties often returned with little success because the settlers lacked experience tracking unfamiliar animals. Fishing offered hope, but even that required learning seasonal patterns that local tribes understood instinctively. Each passing week reminded the colonists that imported food could never sustain them. The land itself had to provide. Some settlers attempted to plant familiar European crops. Others experimented cautiously with local farming techniques observed from neighboring communities. Success came slowly. Every meal reflected uncertainty. Some evenings a colony gathered around modest fires, sharing enough food to feel optimistic. Other nights portions became noticeably smaller. The children noticed first. Parents quietly skipped meals whenever possible. Adults smiled through hunger so younger mouths could eat. John White kept careful watch over morale. Leadership in such circumstances extended far beyond issuing orders. He settled disagreements before they escalated, organized work schedules, assigned hunting parties, directed construction projects, encouraged exhausted families, tried to maintain discipline while avoiding despair. But beneath the appearance of order, anxiety steadily grew. Scouts occasionally reported seeing unfamiliar groups observing the settlement from distant tree lines. No attacks occurred. No warnings were spoken. They simply watched. Whether these observers intended peace, curiosity, or something more threatening remains unknown. To nervous colonists already isolated thousands of miles from home, every unseen movement inside the forest seemed significant. The woods surrounding Roanoke were unlike anything most English settlers had ever experienced. Massive oak and pine trees blocked sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Thick undergrowth muffled footsteps. Strange birds called from invisible branches overhead. At night, wolves howled in the distance while unknown creatures moved through the darkness beyond the colony's wooden walls. Many settlers later described the forest as beautiful during daylight. At night, they became something entirely different. Darkness arrived quickly beneath the dense canopy. Without modern lighting, the wilderness seemed endless. Every snap branch sounded closer than it truly was. Every shadow suggested unseen eyes. Despite these fears, life continued. Children laughed between unfinished houses. Families celebrated small accomplishments. Gardens slowly expanded. Tools rang against freshly cut timber. Prayers echoed every Sunday. For brief moments, the settlement almost resembled the permanent community everyone had imagined before leaving England. Then reality returned. The colony remained dangerously dependent on outside supplies. Seeds alone could not guarantee immediate harvests. Wild game fluctuated. Trade remained uncertain. Winter would arrive long before the settlement became self-sufficient. John White reached a painful conclusion. Someone had to return to England. Only fresh supplies could ensure the colony's survival. It was a terrible decision. The Atlantic crossing itself could take months. Political events in Europe might delay any return voyage even longer. Leaving meant abandoning his family, including his newborn granddaughter Virginia Dare, to face an uncertain future without him. Yet staying offered no better solution. Without additional food, tools, and settlers, the entire colony faced starvation. The colonists gathered to discuss the situation. Many resisted the idea. Others argued it was their only realistic chance. Eventually, they pleaded with John White to make the journey himself. He knew England. He knew Sir Walter Raleigh. He could explain exactly what the colony needed. Most importantly, they trusted him to return. John White hesitated. His daughter begged him not to leave. His granddaughter had been alive only a matter of days. Every instinct told him to remain with his family, but duty demanded otherwise. He promised everyone the same thing. He would sail to England, gather supplies as quickly as possible, and return before they knew it. None of those gathered that day could imagine they were witnessing the final farewell between John White and nearly every person he loved. The promise he made would haunt him for the rest of his life. John White left Roanoke carrying far more than a list of supplies. He carried the hopes of every family who remained behind. As the ship slowly pulled away from the shoreline in late August of 1587, dozens of settlers gathered along the beach to watch them disappear into the Atlantic. Wives embraced husbands one last time. Children waved until the sails became tiny white dots against the horizon. Some cried openly. Others forced smiles, believing they would see one another again within a few months. John White looked back repeatedly. Somewhere on that shoreline stood his daughter, Eleanor Dare. In her arms rested his newborn granddaughter, Virginia. He could not know that it would be the last time he would ever see either of them. The voyage back to England proved difficult, but not extraordinary by the standards of the age. Storms battered the ships. Food grew scarce. Illness spread among portions of the crew. Yet compared to what awaited White upon his return, the Atlantic itself would seem almost merciful. England was preparing for war. King Philip II of Spain had assembled what would become known as the Spanish Armada, one of the largest naval forces ever seen in Europe. Rumors of invasion spread through every English port. Shipyards worked day and night. Merchants feared losing their vessels. Captains received orders placing national defense above every colonial ambition. John White arrived expecting to organize another expedition immediately. Instead, he found an entire kingdom focused on survival. He pleaded with Sir Walter Raleigh. He explained that more than 100 settlers, including women and children, depended upon immediate assistance. Every month mattered. Every delay increased the danger. Raleigh sympathized. But sympathy could not create ships that no longer existed. The English crown had commandeered nearly every seaworthy vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic. Merchant ships became military transports. Sailors joined the Navy. Supplies intended for colonial ventures were redirected toward the coming conflict with Spain. White searched desperately for alternatives. He negotiated with private ship owners. He appealed to investors. He sought anyone willing to finance a rescue voyage. At last, after months of waiting, 2 smaller vessels agreed to attempt the crossing. Hope returned. Perhaps the colony could still be saved. The ships departed England with every intention of reaching Roanoke. But fate intervened once again. French privateers, licensed raiders who preyed upon merchant vessels during wartime, intercepted the expedition in the Atlantic. The encounter quickly turned violent. Cannons roared across the sea. Musket fire echoed between the ships. The English crews fought fiercely, but the damage proved devastating. Supplies were stolen. Crew members were wounded. The ships themselves suffered severe structural damage. Barely able to remain afloat, the captains made the painful decision to abandon the mission and return to England. John White had come so close. The colony remained beyond reach. The failure crushed him. Months became a year, then 2 years. By 1588, England's attention centered entirely upon defeating the Spanish Armada. The famous naval campaign would ultimately end in English victory, but consumed enormous resources, money, and manpower. Colonial projects slipped further down the list of national priorities. For the families left behind on Roanoke, every passing season unfolded without the supplies they had been promised. No new tools arrived, no fresh food, no additional settlers, no letters, no explanation, only silence. John White later wrote of the unbearable guilt he carried during those years. Every sunrise brought the same thought. Were they still alive? Had the harvest succeeded? Had disease reached the settlement? Were Eleanor and little Virginia safe? He imagined countless possibilities. Perhaps they had expanded the colony. Perhaps they had relocated to a safer location. Perhaps friendly native communities had helped them survive. Whenever hope faded, he reminded himself of the agreement they had made before his departure. If danger forced them to move, they would leave a message. If they relocated willingly, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or a post. If they were forced to leave under immediate threat, they would also carve a Maltese cross beside the message to indicate distress. It was a simple plan, elegant, practical. One word could tell him everything he needed to know. But first, he had to get back. Finally, in 1590, nearly 3 years after leaving Roanoke, another opportunity appeared. John White secured passage aboard an expedition commanded by John Watts. The fleet's primary objective was not rescuing colonists. It was privateering against Spanish interests. Roanoke would simply be a stop along the way. White accepted without hesitation. He no longer cared why the ships were sailing, only that they were. The Atlantic crossing seemed longer than ever. Every storm tested his patience. Every delay felt unbearable. At night, he stood on deck staring westward, imagining the moment he would embrace his daughter once more. He pictured Virginia Dare no longer as an infant. She would now be nearly 3 years old. Perhaps she could already speak. Perhaps she could run through the colony's narrow paths. Perhaps she would meet him for the very first time with curiosity instead of recognition. Those thoughts sustained him throughout the voyage. As the expedition approached the outer banks of present-day North Carolina, excitement spread among the crew. Land. After years of waiting, Roanoke was finally within reach. Yet nature offered one final warning. Dark clouds gathered over the coastline. Strong winds pushed against the ships. Violent surf crashed onto hidden sandbars that had already claimed countless vessels over previous decades. Anchoring safely proved almost impossible. Several attempts to land failed. The weather forced the expedition to wait. Every additional hour tormented John White. He had already lost nearly 3 years. Now even the sea itself seemed determined to steal a few more days. At last, conditions improved just enough for a landing party to make its way toward the island. White stepped into the small boat with emotions impossible to describe. Relief, fear, hope, dread. He was finally returning home. But deep inside, another feeling had begun to grow. An instinct that something had gone terribly wrong. He could not explain it. He simply felt it. As the boat approached the familiar shoreline, no welcoming voices reached the beach. No smoke rose from cooking fires. No children ran toward the water. The island stood silent, far too silent. The landing party moved cautiously through the shallow waters, dragging the small boats onto the familiar shoreline. John White stepped onto the sand with trembling legs. 3 years earlier, he had departed from this very island believing he would return within months. He expected to hear voices, see smoke rising from cooking fires, and perhaps even catch sight of little Virginia Dare running to the settlement as a toddler. Instead, only silence greeted him. At first, White tried to convince himself that everyone was simply working elsewhere. Perhaps the colonists were tending fields. Perhaps they had gone fishing. Perhaps hunting parties had ventured into the forests. The stillness felt strange, but not yet terrifying. The rescue party followed the worn path leading toward the settlement. The forest appeared different. Nature had begun reclaiming the trails. Bushes crowded the edges of the path. Young trees had sprouted where open ground once existed. Grass covered footprints that had long since disappeared. Every step suggested that far more than a few months had passed without regular activity. Soon, the first buildings came into view, or rather, what remained of them. Several wooden houses still stood. Others had partially collapsed. The protective fence surrounding the colony had been reinforced and extended, suggesting the settlers had invested considerable effort after John White's departure. That detail immediately caught his attention. People had not fled in panic immediately after he left. They had stayed. They had worked. They had continued building. This alone told him an important part of the story. The colony had survived for some time. The rescue party entered through an opening in the palisade. Every man instinctively tightened his grip on his weapon. They expected an ambush, or perhaps bodies. Instead, nothing. No skeletons. Not serious. No scattered possessions. No signs of battle. No bloodstains. The settlement appeared empty, almost deliberately empty. John White walked slowly between the abandoned structures. He recognized familiar buildings, the location where families had shared meals, the workshop where carpenters repaired tools, the area where Eleanor had once held baby Virginia in her arms. Everything remained strangely intact, yet everyone was gone. The houses themselves offered another surprise. Most had not been destroyed by fire. They had not been violently demolished. Instead, many appeared to have been carefully dismantled. Timber had been removed methodically. Boards were missing in ways suggesting intention rather than destruction. Whoever left had taken valuable building materials with them. That realization changed everything. If enemies had massacred the settlers, why dismantle houses? If a sudden attack had occurred, why carry away lumber? The evidence suggested preparation, planning, time. Someone had intentionally packed up part of the settlement. But why? And where had they gone? The rescue party spread throughout the colonies, searching every remaining structure. Inside one building, they found scattered household items of little value. In another, rusted iron objects lay abandoned. A few broken barrels remained where they had fallen years before. Yet the vast majority of useful possessions had disappeared. Tools, weapons, cooking equipment, personal belongings, livestock, even many doors had been removed. It looked less like a catastrophe and more like an organized departure. John White's emotions swung wildly between hope and despair. If the settlers had packed their belongings, perhaps they were alive. Perhaps they had simply relocated. Perhaps they still waited somewhere nearby. He called out repeatedly, "Eleanor, Virginia." His voice echoed through the empty settlement. Only the wind answered. Hours passed. No one appeared. The men searched beyond the houses. They inspected nearby clearings, followed old paths into the woods, examined the shoreline. There were no fresh tracks, of course. 3 years had erased nearly every physical trace. But something else seemed equally strange. There were almost no signs of violent struggle anywhere. No shattered defenses. No burned fortifications. No mass graves. Even if an attack had occurred years earlier, investigators expected at least some evidence. Instead, Roanoke looked as though its inhabitants had simply vanished. Then someone called for John White. One of the sailors had noticed markings carved into a wooden post standing near the entrance of the settlement. White hurried over. 3 letters. Simple, cleanly carved. Crow. His heart began racing. He immediately remembered the agreement. If the colonists moved voluntarily, they would leave the name of their destination. The search party continued examining nearby trees. Then they found it, carved deeply into the trunk of a large tree. Croton. The word stood clear despite years of exposure to wind and rain. Every letter remained unmistakable. John White stared at the carving in silence. Croton. He knew exactly what it meant. Croton was the name of a nearby island, located to the south, where friendly native communities lived. It was also Manio's homeland. Of every possible message the settlers could have left, this was perhaps the most hopeful. It suggested relocation, rather than destruction. Then White looked carefully for something else. The Maltese Cross. Before leaving Roanoke, everyone had agreed that if they were forced to abandon the settlement under immediate danger, they would carve a cross beside the destination as a warning. He searched the post, the tree, every nearby surface. Nothing. No cross. Only the single word. Croton. If the agreement had been followed, that meant the colonists had not believed they were fleeing imminent disaster. They had chosen to leave. That realization filled White with cautious optimism. Perhaps his family still lived. Perhaps they had joined friendly communities. Perhaps the mystery would end within days. All he needed to do now was sail to Croton Island. It should have been the easiest part of the entire journey. Instead, nature intervened once again, and history would never be the same. John White wasted no time. The moment he read the word carved into the tree, his thoughts turned south toward Croton Island. If the agreement among the settlers had been honored, then the mystery might already have an answer. The colonists had not vanished. They had relocated. Perhaps they had abandoned Roanoke because the land could no longer support them. Perhaps relations with neighboring tribes had deteriorated. Or perhaps Manio had convinced them that Croton offered better protection, more reliable food, and stronger alliances. Whatever the reason, there was finally a direction to follow. For the first time in years, White felt genuine hope. His daughter might still be alive. Virginia Dare, now nearly 3 years old, might be growing up among the people of Croton. The terrible uncertainty that had haunted him for 3 years suddenly seemed close to ending. He immediately urged the expedition's commanders to prepare the ships. The distance separating Roanoke from Croton was not enormous. Under favorable weather conditions, they could reach the island quickly. Every member of the rescue party agreed. The next destination was obvious, but the Atlantic Ocean had never cared about human plans. As preparations began, dark clouds gathered across the horizon. The wind strengthened steadily. Experienced sailors immediately recognized the danger. The waters surrounding the Outer Banks had earned a fearsome reputation long before European settlements arrived. Hidden sandbars stretched beneath the surface, like invisible traps. Powerful currents shifted constantly. Sudden storms appeared with almost no warning. Generations of sailors would later call this coastline the graveyard of the Atlantic. Even in calm weather, navigating these waters demanded exceptional skill. During storms, it became a gamble with death. By nightfall, the sea had transformed completely. Massive waves pounded against the anchored ships. The masts groaned under violent gusts. Rigging snapped. Crew members struggled simply to keep the vessels from running aground. John White pleaded with the captains. Every hour mattered. If the settlers were alive on Croton, they were only a short distance away. Surely they could wait until the storm weakened. But the captains faced responsibilities extending beyond White's desperate search. Losing an entire ship would mean sacrificing dozens of lives. No experienced commander willingly sailed into waters that even local fishermen feared during bad weather. The decision was made. They would wait. Morning brought no improvement. The storm intensified. Rain reduced visibility almost to nothing. Towering waves crashed across the decks. Anchors strained beneath enormous pressure. At one point, one of the anchor cables snapped entirely, forcing frantic sailors to prevent the vessel from drifting onto hidden shoals. The fleet itself now risked destruction. John White watched helplessly from the deck. Croton remained somewhere beyond the gray horizon, close enough to imagine, impossible to reach. Several days passed. Food supplies aboard the ships dwindled. Fresh water required careful rationing. The commanders met repeatedly to discuss their options. Each conclusion remained the same. Continuing toward Croton could destroy every vessel. Returning open sea offered the only reasonable chance of survival. For White, the discussion felt unbearable. He had crossed the Atlantic. He had found the message. He stood closer to the answer than anyone else had ever come. And now, nature itself stood between him and the truth. He argued passionately. He reminded the captains why the expedition had landed. He begged them to make one final attempt. But naval discipline left little room for emotion. The decision remained unchanged. The rescue expedition would leave. John White later described this moment as one of the greatest heartbreaks of his life. He could see the final clue. He knew where it pointed. Yet he would never be allowed to follow it. As the ships raised their sails and slowly departed the Outer Banks, White stared toward the southern horizon until land disappeared completely. He believed his family might still be alive only a few dozen miles away. Yet those few miles became an impossible distance. He would never return. The voyage back to England passed in silence. Unlike his previous crossings, hope no longer sustained him. Questions filled every waking hour. Why had the settlers chosen Croton? Had everyone gone together? Had anyone remained behind? Why had they taken so many belongings? Had they been welcomed? Had disease reached them afterward? Were Eleanor and Virginia still alive when he stood only a short sail away? No answers came. Only endless speculation. Back in England, John White devoted much of the remainder of his life to recounting the events at Roanoke. His journals became the single most important first-hand record of the colony's disappearance. Without them, historians would know remarkably little about what happened. Yet even White admitted the painful truth. He had failed, not because he abandoned the colony intentionally, not because he lacked determination, but because history itself had intervened. War, storms, politics, bad timing. Every obstacle had arrived at precisely the wrong moment. Years later, White would write words filled with grief rather than certainty. He never claimed to know what ultimately happened to the colonists. He simply hoped they had survived. It was a hope he carried until his death. For more than 4 centuries afterward, countless historians, archaeologists, explorers, and writers will return to the same mystery. What became of the 115 settlers? Did they truly reach Croton? Did they build new lives among native communities? Or had the carved word itself concealed an even deeper story? The answers, if they still existed, remained buried somewhere beneath forests, shifting coastlines, and centuries of forgotten history. But one thing was certain. The mystery had only just begun. For nearly 4 centuries, one question has echoed through history. What happened to the people of Roanoke after John White sailed away? Because no eyewitness account survives, every answer begins with the same handful of facts. 115 settlers were alive when White departed in 1587. When he returned in 1590, the colony was empty. There were no bodies, no signs of a massacre, no burned buildings, no mass graves. The fortifications had actually been improved. Many houses had been carefully dismantled. Most valuable possessions had been taken, and one single word remained behind: Croton. Those facts are remarkably few, yet they are also remarkably important. Modern historians often remind us that mysteries are not solved by imagination alone. They are solved by examining evidence piece by piece, separating what is documented from what has simply been repeated over generations. The first and most widely accepted explanation is also the least dramatic. The settlers survived. According to this theory, Roanoke simply became impossible to sustain. Food shortages likely worsened over time. Relations with certain neighboring tribes remained tense. Supply ships never arrived. The colonists understood that waiting indefinitely would eventually lead to starvation. So they did exactly what practical people would do. They moved. Croton Island offered several advantages. It was home to native communities already familiar with Manteo. Fishing opportunities were excellent. Fresh water was more dependable. The population was smaller and easier to support through cooperation. If the settlers relocated there peacefully, dismantling houses suddenly makes perfect sense. Lumber was valuable. Iron nails were valuable. Doors, beams, tools, cooking equipment. Nothing would be wasted. Rather than abandoning an entire settlement, they may have carried whatever they could transport and rebuilt elsewhere. To many historians, this explanation matches nearly every known piece of evidence. It explains the missing supplies. It explains the absence of violence. It explains why no distress cross accompanied the carved message. Most importantly, it explains why only the destination was written. The settlers may never have imagined that future generations would transform their relocation into one of history's greatest mysteries. To them, the message may have been completely ordinary. A simple note for John White: "We've gone to Croton." Nothing more. Several decades after the colony disappeared, English explorers recorded intriguing conversations with native communities living along the Carolina coast. Some tribal leaders claimed that white settlers had once lived among neighboring peoples. Others described individuals with unusually light skin or gray eyes. One report even mentioned native families who could supposedly read from old English books passed down through earlier generations. These stories fascinated historians. Were they evidence, or simply legends shaped over time? The difficulty lies in timing. Most of these accounts were recorded many years after Roanoke vanished. Human memory changes. Stories grow. Details become exaggerated. Without contemporary documents confirming those claims, historians must treat them cautiously. Still, the reports cannot simply be ignored. Archaeologists have also uncovered European objects at several Native American settlements dating to roughly the correct period. Iron tools, copper items, fragments of English pottery, metalworking materials. At first glance, these discoveries appear exciting. Could they prove the colonists joined native communities? Perhaps. But another explanation exists: trade. European goods spread surprisingly quickly through exchange networks long before permanent settlements expanded across North America. An iron axe might pass through dozens of villages over many years. A copper kettle could be reshaped into tools or ornaments hundreds of miles from where Europeans first introduced it. Finding English artifacts alone cannot prove English settlers lived there. Context matters. Where exactly were the objects found? How many existed? Were they ordinary trade items or personal belongings unlikely to be exchanged? Every discovery raises as many questions as answers. Modern archaeological excavations continue searching for clearer evidence. Advanced technology now allows researchers to analyze tiny soil changes, buried foundations, pollen records, and microscopic fragments impossible to detect a century ago. Several promising sites have emerged. Some investigators believe small groups from Roanoke split apart rather than remaining together. Perhaps one family joined Croton. Another settled farther inland. Others may have attempted independent farms. Such fragmentation would explain why no large English village has ever been discovered. Instead of disappearing together, they may have slowly blended into several different communities. Over generations, languages changed, clothing changed, customs merged. Children grew up with mixed ancestry. The identity of Roanoke colonists gradually faded until only memories remained. Ironically, survival itself may have erased evidence. History often remembers dramatic endings. Entire populations wiped out, cities destroyed, battles lost. But people who quietly adapt, people who build new lives, sometimes disappear from written history altogether. If this theory is correct, the lost colony was never truly lost. Its people simply stopped calling themselves English colonists. They became part of an entirely different world. It is a quiet explanation, a deeply human one, and for many historians today, it remains the most convincing possibility. While the theory of peaceful relocation is the most widely accepted today, it is far from the only explanation historians have considered. For centuries, countless researchers have asked a darker question. What if the settlers never reached Croton at all? What if something happened during the journey? Or shortly after they arrived? Life on the American coast in the late 16th century was extraordinarily fragile. The English often imagined the New World as a vast land waiting to be settled. The reality was very different. The coastal environment could become unforgiving with almost no warning. Hurricanes swept across the Atlantic every year. Flooding destroyed crops. Salt water contaminated fresh wells. Droughts sometimes lasted for entire growing seasons. Game animals migrated unpredictably. Fish stocks changed with the weather. A single failed harvest could place an entire community at risk of starvation. Unlike Europe, there were no nearby towns to request assistance. No roads connected distant settlements. No relief ships arrived on predictable schedules. Every mistake carried enormous consequences. Historians know that the years immediately following John White's departure coincided with one of the most difficult climatic periods in centuries. Modern scientists have studied tree rings taken from ancient bald cypress trees growing near Roanoke. These natural records preserve yearly patterns of rainfall with remarkable precision. The results revealed something extraordinary. Between 1587 and 1589, the region experienced one of the worst droughts recorded in hundreds of years. Streams shrank. Harvests likely failed. Fresh water sources became increasingly unreliable. Even native communities, whose knowledge of the land far exceeded that of the English settlers, would have struggled under such conditions. For Roanoke, already isolated and waiting for supplies that never arrived, the drought may have transformed hardship into desperation. Imagine trying to feed more than 100 people while crops wither beneath relentless heat. Imagine watching food stores disappear week after week with no certainty that rescue would ever come. Under those circumstances, relocating would not simply have been sensible. It may have become absolutely necessary. Yet relocation carried dangers of its own. Traveling through unfamiliar forests with children, elderly settlers, livestock, tools, and food supplies would have been painfully slow. The journey required crossing rivers, marshes, and dense woodlands. Every mile exposed the colonists to disease, accidents, and possible conflict. If several groups traveled separately, they became even more vulnerable. Some historians believe that only part of the colony successfully reached Croton. Others may have attempted to settle farther inland. Still others could have perished along the way from hunger or illness. Because no written record survived, even a relatively small tragedy could vanish completely from history. Disease represented another constant threat. Europeans arriving in the Americas unknowingly introduced devastating illnesses to native populations, but the exchange worked both ways. English settlers also encountered unfamiliar diseases against which they possessed little immunity. Simple infections became deadly. Minor wounds turned fatal without antibiotics. Contaminated water spread intestinal diseases rapidly through crowded settlements. Children suffered the greatest risk. Virginia Dare, born only days before John White departed, entered one of the harshest environments imaginable for an infant. No modern medicine, no hospitals, no trained physicians, only limited herbal remedies and whatever experience the settlers themselves possessed. Her survival alone would have depended upon extraordinary resilience. There is another possibility that historians sometimes discuss. What if the colony gradually dissolved rather than disappearing all at once? Perhaps several families left first. Weeks later, others followed. Some remained behind, hoping for rescue. Eventually, the last few settlers also abandoned the site. If that happened, Roanoke's disappearance was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow process stretching across months. Each departure made those remaining even more vulnerable. Every family that left reduced the colony's workforce. Fewer farmers, fewer hunters, fewer carpenters, fewer defenders. As numbers declined, staying became increasingly difficult. One departure encouraged another, until finally no one remained. This gradual collapse fits surprisingly well with archaeological evidence. There are no signs of panic, no evidence of sudden destruction. Instead, everything suggests deliberate decisions made over time, careful packing, systematic dismantling of buildings, organized removal of supplies, actions impossible to accomplish during a hurried escape. The mystery, therefore, may not revolve around one catastrophic moment. It may instead reflect dozens of difficult choices made by ordinary people trying to keep their families alive. Parents choosing food over pride, neighbors choosing cooperation over isolation, leaders accepting that the original dream had failed. Sometimes history searches for dramatic endings because dramatic stories are easier to remember, but real life often unfolds differently. Communities rarely vanish in a single night. More often, they slowly adapt to impossible circumstances until the place they once called home is simply abandoned. If that is what happened at Roanoke, then the mystery becomes even more profound, not because the colonists disappeared, but because they survived long enough to make impossible decisions that history never bothered to record. Their greatest struggle may not have been a battle against enemies. It may have been a battle against hunger, exhaustion, uncertainty, and the relentless realization that England was never coming back. As decades passed, the disappearance of Roanoke slowly transformed from a colonial mystery into a legend. Each generation added new details. Each storyteller introduced new possibilities. By the 18th century, people no longer asked only what had happened to the colonists. They began asking whether traces of them could still be found among the people living in the Carolinas. One of the earliest clues came from English explorer John Lawson. Around 1701, more than 100 years after Roanoke vanished, Lawson traveled extensively through the Carolina wilderness, documenting the geography, wildlife, and native nations he encountered. His writings would later become some of the most frequently quoted sources in discussions about the lost colony. During his travels, Lawson met members of the Hatteras people, descendants of those who had once lived on Croton Island. According to his account, several tribal members claimed that some of their ancestors had welcomed white settlers many years earlier. Even more intriguing, Lawson reported noticing individuals with gray eyes among members of the community. Gray eyes were uncommon in native populations. To many readers in England, the observation seemed extraordinary. Could these people be descendants of Roanoke? Lawson himself remained cautious. He did not present the observation as proof. He merely recorded what he had seen and what local people had told him. Over time, however, later writers repeated the story with increasing confidence. Gray eyes became blue eyes. A few individuals became entire villages. Possibilities slowly hardened into supposed facts. This is one of history's greatest challenges. Stories evolve. Every retelling subtly changes the original. Historians today carefully separate Lawson's actual words from the many embellishments added afterward. Still, his testimony remains important because it represents one of the earliest independent accounts suggesting that English colonists may have been absorbed into native communities. Other colonial officials reported similar rumors. Some claimed certain tribes possessed European-style tools that seemed older than recent trade would explain. Others mentioned people who spoke of ancestors arriving from the east by sea. A few even described native families preserving unusual customs that appeared partly European. Individually, none of these reports prove anything. Together, however, they form an intriguing pattern. The possibility refuses to disappear. Throughout the 19th century, the mystery attracted growing public fascination. America was becoming increasingly interested in its own early history. Roanoke occupied a unique place within that story. It represented not military victory, not political revolution, but unanswered questions. Novelists embraced the mystery. Poets romanticized Virginia Dare as a tragic heroine. Painters imagined abandoned villages hidden beneath towering forests. Some stories claimed she survived into adulthood. Others insisted she had become part of a native tribe. Still others invented dramatic rescues, secret romances, or supernatural endings. Almost none of these tales rested upon historical evidence. Yet they shaped public imagination for generations. Virginia Dare, who had lived only as an infant in the surviving records, gradually became one of the most famous missing children in American history. Entire books were written about someone historians know almost nothing about. That irony perfectly captures the power of Roanoke. The fewer facts existed, the more room remained for imagination. By the early 20th century, professional archaeology began replacing speculation with scientific investigation. Researchers no longer relied solely upon old journals and oral traditions. They started digging. Excavations at Roanoke uncovered remnants of the original settlement, fragments of pottery, iron nails, glass beads, musket balls, animal bones, pieces of everyday life frozen beneath layers of earth. Each discovery confirmed that English families had indeed lived there, but none answered the central question: where had they gone? As archaeological techniques improved throughout the 20th century, investigators expanded their search far beyond Roanoke Island. Perhaps the colony had relocated. If so, evidence should exist elsewhere. Teams surveyed nearby islands, river valleys, ancient native villages, possible English campsites. Sometimes they uncovered promising clues. Sometimes months of excavation revealed nothing at all. One discovery generated particular excitement. Researchers found European objects dating to approximately the correct period buried within areas associated with native settlements. These included metal tools, pottery fragments, and other imported goods. Were they left behind by Roanoke settlers or acquired through trade? The distinction mattered enormously. Trade networks among native nations extended across vast distances. An English object might pass through dozens of communities over many decades before finally being buried. Without additional evidence, archaeologists could not confidently identify the original owner. The mystery remained stubbornly resistant. Every answer created two new questions. Every clue pointed in multiple directions. And perhaps that is why Roanoke continues to fascinate historians today. Unlike many historical mysteries, eventually solved by a single discovery, Roanoke offers no decisive breakthrough. Instead, it presents fragments, small pieces of a puzzle whose final image remains hidden. A carved word, a dismantled village, a missing population, scattered artifacts, centuries-old memories, none sufficient alone, yet together enough to ensure that the lost colony would never truly be forgotten. By the late 20th century, the mystery of Roanoke had entered a new era. For generations, historians relied almost entirely on journals, letters, oral traditions, and scattered archaeological discoveries. Now, science itself was beginning to investigate the mystery. New technologies allowed researchers to examine the landscape in ways John White could never have imagined. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, chemical soil analysis, digital mapping, microscopic examination of artifacts. Every new method offered a possibility that the next breakthrough might finally reveal where the colonists had gone. One of the most intriguing discoveries began not in the ground, but on an old map. John White had done more than lead the colony. He had carefully drawn detailed maps of the Carolina coastline during his earlier expeditions. One of those maps survived for centuries in the archives of the British Museum. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, just another 16th century chart. But historians noticed something unusual. A small patch of paper had been pasted over one section of the map. It looked almost like a repair. For hundreds of years, no one questioned it. Then modern imaging techniques changed everything. Conservators carefully examined a hidden section using transmitted light and advanced photography. Beneath the patch, another symbol appeared. It resembled the outline of a small fort. The discovery immediately sparked worldwide attention. Could John White have secretly marked another planned settlement? Had the colonists moved inland rather than remaining near the coast? Was this hidden fort the destination that had never been documented? Excitement spread quickly if the symbol represented a real location. Archaeologists suddenly had a new place to investigate. Excavations soon began in the area identified by the map. Researchers uncovered fragments of English pottery dating to roughly the correct period, pieces of ceramic storage jars, metal objects, building materials. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that history's greatest colonial mystery was finally being solved. But archaeology is rarely that simple. The artifacts were genuine, yet they were surprisingly few, not enough to prove that an entire colony had relocated there. Some experts suggested the location may have served as a small outpost rather than a permanent settlement. Others proposed that only a handful of colonists reached the site, perhaps scouts, perhaps a single family, perhaps survivors from a larger group. Still others argued that later English travelers could have left the objects decades afterward. Once again, evidence existed. Certainty did not. Another important investigation focused on what archaeologists call Site X. Located farther inland from Roanoke, this area produced additional English artifacts from the late 16th century. Fragments of decorated pottery, glass pieces, metalworking remains, objects that appeared too early to belong to later colonial settlements. Could this finally be the missing colony? Opinions differed sharply. Some researchers believed Site X represented one destination reached by a portion of the settlers. Others warned against drawing conclusions too quickly. Trade between native communities could explain many imported objects. Without unmistakable evidence such as English houses, written documents, or graves, caution remained essential. The debate continues today. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these discoveries is what they reveal about the nature of history itself. Many people imagine archaeology as dramatic moments where buried treasures instantly solve ancient mysteries. Reality is far quieter. A single pottery fragment may require months of laboratory analysis. One iron nail can generate years of scholarly debate. Entire careers are devoted to interpreting a handful of broken objects. Progress comes slowly, painfully slowly. Every conclusion must withstand intense scrutiny. Because once history accepts an explanation, correcting mistakes becomes extraordinarily difficult. That is why modern historians often resist sensational claims. The mystery of Roanoke has attracted countless theories over 4 centuries. Some are reasonable. Others belong more to fiction than history. Scientific investigation demands patience. It demands admitting uncertainty whenever evidence remains incomplete. Ironically, that willingness to say we don't know is one of the greatest strengths of historical research. It protects the past from becoming whatever people wish it to be. Even today, excavations continue across parts of North Carolina. Every few years, new discoveries generate fresh headlines. A forgotten artifact, a newly analyzed document, an overlooked campsite. Each one raises hope that the final answer might finally emerge. Yet every discovery also reminds researchers how much has already been lost. Coastlines have shifted dramatically since the 16th century. Storms have eroded entire sections of land. Rising sea levels have submerged ancient shorelines beneath the Atlantic. Forests have grown where villages once stood. Rivers have changed course. If physical evidence still exists, some of it may now lie beneath water. Some may have been destroyed centuries ago. Some may never be found. History does not preserve every answer. Sometimes it preserves only enough clues to remind us that an answer once existed. And Roanoke may be the greatest example of that truth, a mystery suspended forever between evidence and silence. If there is one reason the lost colony of Roanoke has survived for more than 4 centuries in the public imagination, it is because the mystery refused to remain within the boundaries of history. It became something larger, a legend, and like all great legends, it attracted theories that range from carefully reasoned explanations to the truly extraordinary. Almost every generation has produced its own answer. Some sought logic, others sought wonder. The earliest rumors appeared only decades after the colony vanished. English settlers arriving later in North America heard stories from neighboring tribes about pale-skinned people living farther inland. Some claimed these strangers had learned native languages. Others insisted they had abandoned English clothing altogether. There were stories of villages where European customs mixed naturally with indigenous traditions. No written proof accompanied these tales. Yet they spread quickly. The idea that the colonists had survived quietly among native communities offered hope. It also made sense to many people. If rescue never came, what other choice would the settlers have had? But not everyone accepted that explanation. Another theory suggested something far darker. Perhaps relations with nearby tribes had eventually collapsed. Perhaps years of drought had intensified competition over food. Perhaps the settlers had wandered into hostile territory. Some historians considered the possibility of conflict. After all, violence between Europeans and native peoples was tragically common throughout the era. Yet Roanoke presents an important problem. Where is the evidence? Massacres leave traces. Weapons, burned structures, human remains, defensive positions. None of these have been discovered at Roanoke itself. That absence does not completely eliminate the possibility of violence. It simply makes it difficult to prove. As centuries passed, imagination filled the gaps left by missing evidence. Victorian writers transformed Virginia Dare into a mythical figure. One popular story claimed she had survived into adulthood but had been cursed by supernatural forces. Another insisted she became a white deer wandering endlessly through the Carolina forests. These stories had no historical foundation whatsoever. They belonged entirely to folklore. Yet millions of Americans grew up hearing them. Even today, Virginia Dare appears in novels, plays, paintings, and local traditions. History ended. Legend continued. Then came even stranger explanations. Some suggested Spanish soldiers secretly destroyed the colony. Spain certainly viewed English expansion as a threat. Its ships operated throughout the Atlantic. Could a hidden Spanish expedition have eliminated Roanoke? Researchers searched Spanish military records. Nothing convincing emerged. An operation of that scale would almost certainly have been documented somewhere within Spain's remarkably detailed archives. No such record has ever been found. Others propose pirates. Again, possible in theory, unlikely in practice. Pirates sought wealth. Roanoke possessed very little worth stealing. A struggling settlement filled with farmers offered almost no reward compared to heavily loaded merchant ships crossing the Caribbean. Then there are the theories that belong entirely outside conventional history. Some people have suggested alien abductions. Others blame mysterious portals, ancient curses, lost civilizations, secret underground worlds. These ideas appear regularly in television documentaries, internet discussions, and popular books. They capture attention. They generate headlines. But they share one common problem. They possess no supporting historical evidence. Professional historians generally dismiss them for that reason. History depends upon documents, artifacts, archaeology, contemporary accounts. Without evidence, a theory remains only speculation. Still, there is something fascinating about these imaginative explanations. They reveal less about Roanoke and more about us, Human beings dislike unanswered questions. Our minds naturally search for complete stories. When evidence disappears, imagination rushes in to fill the empty spaces. Sometimes an imagination creates beautiful legends, sometimes frightening myths, sometimes elaborate conspiracies. Roanoke has inspired every one of them. Perhaps that explains why the mystery never fades. It exists at the perfect intersection between documented history and unanswered possibility. There is enough evidence to prove something remarkable happened. There is not enough evidence to explain exactly what it was. That balance keeps every generation returning to the same question. Children hear the story in school. Students encounter it in history books. Researchers spend decades studying it. Writers reinvent it. Filmmakers dramatize it. Tourists travel to Roanoke Island hoping to stand where the colony once stood. Very few historical mysteries have endured with such power, not because the disappearance itself was necessarily unique, but because the silence left behind proved stronger than any explanation. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not why the colony disappeared. Perhaps it is why one simple carving, one single word, has continued to captivate millions of people for more than 400 years. Croton, a word that may once have been nothing more than practical directions, yet became one of the most haunting messages ever left in human history. Among all the names connected to the mystery of Roanoke, one has become almost symbolic. Virginia Dare. She never wrote a diary. She never left a letter. No portrait of her survives. No one recorded her voice. In fact, historians know remarkably little about her life, and yet she has become one of the most recognizable figures in early American history, not because of what she did, but because of what happened after she was born. Virginia entered the world on August 18, 1587, only days after the settlers arrived at Roanoke Island. Her birth represented something extraordinary. She became the first English child known to have been born in North America. For the struggling colony, the event carried enormous symbolic importance. This was no longer merely an expedition. It was becoming a permanent society. Children represented the future. Families represented stability. The English dream of building a lasting home across the Atlantic suddenly felt real. John White, her grandfather, reportedly viewed her birth with great joy. After months at sea and endless uncertainty, the arrival of new life reminded everyone why they had accepted such extraordinary risks. They were not simply exploring. They were building generations yet to come. No one could have imagined that history would remember Virginia not for the life she lived, but for the questions left behind after she disappeared. When John White sailed back to England only days later, Virginia remained in the colony with her parents. She was an infant, completely dependent upon those around her. Everything that happened afterward remains hidden behind history's silence. Did she survive the first harsh winter? Did she learn to walk beneath the forests of Roanoke? Did she laugh with other children as the settlement slowly adapted to its surroundings? Did she eventually travel with the colonists toward Croton? Or did illness claim her before any relocation ever occurred? There are no surviving documents to answer even these simplest questions. For generations, people tried to imagine a life she might have lived. Some believe she grew into adulthood among native communities. Others claim she married, had children, lived a long life far from England. These stories often appeared sincere, yet almost all emerged centuries after the actual events. None can be verified. Perhaps the most famous legend surrounding Virginia Dare tells of a young woman transformed into a white deer by supernatural forces. According to the tale, she wandered endlessly through the forests of North Carolina until finally being released an enchantment by a silver arrow. It is a beautiful story, a tragic one, but it belongs entirely to folklore. Its popularity says much about human imagination and very little about documented history. Still, legends often emerge where evidence disappears. People struggle to accept that someone so historically important could simply vanish without explanation. The same happened with other famous historical figures whose lives ended mysteriously. When facts are scarce, stories multiply. Virginia became more than a missing child. She became a symbol. Artists painted her. Poets wrote about her. Schools carried her name. Businesses adopted her image. Entire communities celebrated her as part of their local identity. Ironically, the less historians knew about her, the more famous she became. That paradox fascinates many scholars today. How does someone with almost no surviving historical record become one of the most recognizable names in early American history? Part of the answer lies in timing. Virginia Dare's birth marked the beginning of England's permanent ambitions in North America. Her disappearance mirrored the uncertainty surrounding those ambitions. She came to represent both hope and mystery simultaneously. Another reason involves emotion. History often focuses on kings, generals, explorers, and politicians. Virginia was none of those. She was simply a baby, the youngest member of a struggling community trying to survive in an unfamiliar land. When people hear her story, they naturally imagine their own families. Parents wonder how they would have protected an infant under such impossible circumstances. Grandparents think of John White sailing away, believing he would soon return. Few historical mysteries feel as deeply personal. Perhaps that explains why Virginia Dare continues to appear whenever Roanoke is discussed. She reminds us that behind every archaeological artifact, every historical document, every scholarly debate were real people, real families, real children. They laughed, worked, argued, dreamed, loved one another. The lost colony was never simply a historical puzzle. It was a community filled with ordinary human lives interrupted by extraordinary circumstances. Virginia Dare has become the face of those lives, not because history remembered her story, but because history forgot it. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Some mysteries endure because they hide remarkable events. Others endure because they erase ordinary people whose lives deserve to be remembered. Roanoke belongs to both kinds. And Virginia Dare stands forever at the center of that silence. The mystery of Roanoke has fascinated historians for centuries. But there's another question that receives far less attention. What was life actually like inside the colony during those 3 years before John White returned? The answer reveals something important. The settlers did not simply disappear. They struggled every single day. When people imagine a lost colony, they often picture a peaceful village suddenly becoming empty overnight. Reality was almost certainly much harsher. Every sunrise began with work. Someone needed to fetch fresh water. Others repaired roofs damaged by storms. Farmers tended fragile crops. Hunters entered dense forests, searching for deer or wild turkeys. Fishermen launched small boats into unfamiliar waters, where changing tides could easily overturn them. Nothing happened automatically. Everything required labor. Even the simplest meal represented hours of effort. Bread demanded grain. Grain required fields. Fields had to be cleared by hand. Trees felled. Roots removed. Soil prepared. Seeds planted. Weeds controlled. Harvest protected from animals. Every loaf of bread reflected months of work. The settlers quickly discovered that England had not prepared them for North America. The climate differed. The soil behaved differently. The seasons followed unfamiliar rhythms. Plants they expected to grow sometimes failed. Species they had never seen before surrounded them. Knowledge became as valuable as food. This is why relationships with native communities mattered so profoundly. Local peoples possessed generations of experience. They understood which fish arrived during certain months, which berries were safe, which rivers remained reliable during drought, which crops adapted best to local conditions. Without learning at least part of that knowledge, English survival became extraordinarily difficult. Modern historians increasingly recognize that European colonies depended far more upon indigenous expertise than early English writers often admitted. Roanoke was almost certainly no exception. The settlers also faced another challenge rarely discussed: loneliness. Imagine waking each morning knowing that every familiar place from your previous life lay thousands of miles away. No letters would arrive. No merchants visited. No neighboring English villages existed. The Atlantic Ocean isolated them completely. If someone became seriously ill, there was nowhere else to go. If tools broke, replacements might never come. If crops failed, no distant market could provide food. The colony existed alone, completely alone, Children adapted more easily than adults. They explored forests with curiosity rather than fear. They learned new words from native neighbors. They accepted unfamiliar landscapes more naturally than parents who constantly compared everything with England. Adults, meanwhile, carried memories that sometimes made adaptation more difficult. They remembered stone churches, busy marketplaces, family gatherings, seasonal festivals, the sound of church bells. At Roanoke, many of those comforts disappeared. Faith became one of the colony's greatest sources of strength. Like most English communities of the period, the settlers prayed regularly. Religious services helped maintain routine. They reminded people that suffering could carry purpose, that endurance mattered, that hope should survive even when circumstances grew difficult. Whether those prayers strengthened morale or simply offered emotional comfort, they undoubtedly became an important part of daily life. John White himself often wrote about the importance of discipline, not merely military discipline, community discipline, shared responsibilities, mutual cooperation. No family could survive alone. Neighbors depended upon one another constantly. A carpenter repaired another family's roof. Hunters shared meat. Women cared for children whose parents worked elsewhere. Older settlers taught younger ones practical skills. Survival itself became a collective effort. This sense of community may explain another fascinating detail. When archaeologists examined Roanoke, they found no evidence that families abandoned one another during the colony's final days. There were no isolated homes filled with untouched belongings, no signs that only wealthier settlers escaped. Instead, the evidence suggests an organized departure. Entire households packed together. Communities moved together. Whatever decision was ultimately made, it appears to have involved the colony as a whole. That says something remarkable about these people. Despite hardship, despite hunger, despite uncertainty, they remained a community until the very end. Perhaps they argued. Certainly they disagreed. Every isolated settlement does. But when the decisive moment arrived, they seemed to have acted collectively rather than individually. That unity may have been their greatest strength, or perhaps it became their final shared journey into history's silence. Today, visitors walking through reconstructed portions of Roanoke Island often experience an unexpected feeling. The sight is peaceful. Birds sing. Wind moves gently through tall trees. The ocean can be heard in the distance. It is difficult to imagine fear in such a beautiful place. Yet beauty can be deceptive. For the colonists, every peaceful morning carried uncertainty. Would rain destroy the crops? Would hunting succeed? Would supplies finally arrive? Would another winter prove survivable? Behind every ordinary day stood extraordinary pressure. Perhaps that is why the lost colony still resonates so deeply. Its people were not legendary heroes. They were ordinary families trying to build ordinary lives under impossible circumstances. And somewhere between those ordinary hopes and those impossible challenges, history lost sight of them forever. More than 400 years have passed since the settlers of Roanoke disappeared. Empires have risen and fallen. Wars have reshaped continents. Entire civilizations have been rediscovered beneath deserts and jungles. Countless historical mysteries once believed unsolvable have finally found answers through archaeology, science, and newly uncovered documents. Yet Roanoke remains different, not because historians stopped searching, but because the evidence itself seems determined to remain incomplete. Every generation has believed it stood on the verge of solving the mystery, and every generation has discovered that history rarely surrenders its secrets so easily. Modern archaeology has transformed the search in remarkable ways. Researchers no longer rely solely upon shovels and educated guesses. Today, they use drones equipped with high-resolution cameras capable of detecting subtle changes in vegetation that may reveal buried structures. Ground-penetrating radar scans beneath the surface without disturbing the soil. Laser mapping technologies can identify ancient landscapes hidden beneath dense forests. Chemical analysis reveals traces of long-forgotten human activity. Even pollen trapped underground can reconstruct the environment exactly as it existed centuries ago. Every scientific advance offers fresh hope. If traces of the lost colony still survive, surely modern technology can find them. And sometimes It almost does. Over the last several decades, archaeologists have uncovered scattered pieces of the puzzle across coastal North Carolina. A fragment of English pottery here, an iron tool there, glass beads, lead shot, copper objects. Each discovery receives enormous attention. Headlines appear around the world. The lost colony mystery may finally be solved. But once careful analysis begins, the excitement usually fades. An isolated artifact proves only that someone carried it there. It does not reveal who, nor when, nor why. One of archaeology's greatest challenges is understanding context. Imagine finding a modern coin in the middle of a forest. Did someone drop it yesterday? Did it arrive decades ago? Was it carried there by another person? Was it moved by flooding? The object alone tells only part of the story. Historical artifacts behave the same way. Without surrounding evidence, conclusions remain uncertain. That is precisely the problem facing every investigation into Roanoke. Researchers have found clues, many clues, but no discovery has yet connected every piece into one convincing explanation. Some scholars now believe the search itself may have been too narrow for generations. Instead of asking where the colony moved, perhaps we should ask how many places it moved. Human communities rarely behave as single units during prolonged crises. Families separate. Small groups pursue different opportunities. Some remain behind. Others leave first. Children grow up and establish new homes. Entire populations slowly spread across larger regions. Perhaps Roanoke did exactly that. Instead of one destination, there may have been several. This possibility explains why archaeologists keep finding small amounts of English material at different locations rather than one enormous settlement. The colonists may never have intended to remain together permanently. Their priority was survival, not preserving the identity of an English colony. Over time, survival itself may have erased the evidence historians hope to find. Children born after Roanoke's disappearance would have spoken different languages, married into different communities, adopted different traditions. Within only 2 or 3 generations, descendants might no longer remember exactly where their grandparents had first arrived. History often assumes important events leave permanent records. In reality, many disappear naturally. Documents decay. Wood rots. Cloth dissolves. Oral traditions change. Storms reshape coastlines. Rivers wash away campsites. Nature patiently erases human footprints. Roanoke existed in one of the most environmentally dynamic regions of North America. Barrier islands constantly shift. Hurricanes rewrite shorelines. Entire sections of land disappear beneath rising water. Some archaeologists believe portions of the original landscape explored by John White no longer exist above sea level. If they are correct, parts of the mystery now rest beneath the Atlantic Ocean itself. Recovering such evidence becomes extraordinarily difficult. Not impossible, but increasingly unlikely with every passing century. And yet, the search continues. Not because historians expect one dramatic discovery that instantly answers every question, but because each small finding helps us understand the world those colonists inhabited. Every recovered nail reveals something about construction. Every pottery fragment speaks of daily life. Every animal bone tells a story about food. Even when the central mystery remains unsolved, knowledge still grows. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson Roanoke offers. History is not simply about finding final answers. Sometimes its greatest value lies in teaching us how patiently to ask better questions. The lost colony reminds us that certainty is a luxury historians rarely possess. Instead, they work with fragments, probabilities, patterns, possibilities, and occasionally one mysterious word carved into a tree. For centuries later, that single word still guides every search. There is one final question that historians continue to debate, not where the colonists went, but why their disappearance became so famous when so many other early settlements also struggled, failed, or vanished. The answer lies partly in timing. Roanoke was England's first serious attempt to establish a permanent colony in North America. It represented more than a settlement. It represented a promise, a declaration that England intended to become a global power. When that promise disappeared without explanation, The mystery became impossible to ignore. Had Roanoke succeeded, history might remember it simply as another small colonial village. Instead, its failure transformed it into something unforgettable. Ironically, only 17 years after colony vanished, England established another settlement much farther north, Jamestown. Founded in 1607, Jamestown faced many of the same hardships that had plagued Roanoke: disease, starvation, conflict, isolation. At one point, the colony came terrifyingly close to complete collapse. During the winter of 1609 and 1610, remembered as the starving time, hundreds of settlers died from hunger and illness. Historical evidence suggests that some desperate survivors even resorted to cannibalism. Unlike Roanoke, however, Jamestown survived. Supply ships eventually arrived. More settlers followed. The colony slowly stabilized. From Jamestown grew the foundation of England's permanent presence in North America. Looking back, historians often ask an uncomfortable question. What if Roanoke had received the same opportunity? What if John White had returned 6 months later instead of 3 years later? What if the Spanish Armada had never threatened England? What if the rescue expedition had not been delayed by war? Would Roanoke have become another Jamestown? Would school children today learn about it not as the lost colony, but as the birthplace of English America? History sometimes turns upon astonishingly small moments. A storm, a delayed voyage, a political crisis thousands of miles away. None of the settlers on Roanoke could control these events, yet their lives were shaped entirely by them. The colony's disappearance also changed the way future English settlements were planned. Jamestown was supplied more frequently. Military protection received greater attention. Communication with England became more organized. Colonial leaders understood that isolation could destroy even the most determined community. In that sense, Roanoke's failure became an important lesson. Its tragedy influenced the colonies that followed. Although the settlers themselves vanished, the consequences of their experience endured. Perhaps this is one reason historians refuse to stop searching. The lost colony was not merely an isolated incident. It helped shape the future of an empire. It forced England to rethink how colonies should survive across an ocean. Even today, archaeological discoveries at Roanoke contribute to a broader understanding of early colonial life. They reveal how fragile those first settlements truly were. Popular imagination often portrays colonization as a steady expansion across empty land. Reality was far more uncertain. Every settlement balanced between success and disaster. Every harvest mattered. Every supply ship mattered. Every relationship with neighboring native communities mattered. Roanoke reminds us that history is never inevitable. Jamestown survived. Roanoke disappeared. The difference may have depended upon circumstances no one could predict. There is another reason the mystery continues to resonate. It forces us to confront the limits of historical knowledge. Modern society often assumes that every important event has been recorded somewhere, that every mystery eventually yields to science. Roanoke challenges that belief. Sometimes evidence is lost forever. Sometimes witnesses leave no testimony. Sometimes nature quietly erases the traces people leave behind. For historians, accepting uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the discipline itself. The honest answer is not always satisfying. Sometimes the most accurate conclusion is simply, we do not know. That humility separates history from mythology. History follows evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads only to silence. And perhaps nowhere is that silence more profound than at Roanoke. An empty settlement, a carved word, a grandfather who arrived only a few days too late, a child whose future vanished from a record, more than 100 ordinary people whose names survive, but whose final chapter does not. That absence has echoed across more than 4 centuries, not because history forgot to ask what happened, but because history never found anyone left to answer. When historians study the lost colony of Roanoke today, they often arrive at a surprising conclusion. The greatest mystery may not be what happened after the settlers disappeared. It may be why their story continues to feel so deeply personal more than 400 years later. After all, history is filled with vanished civilizations. Entire kingdoms have collapsed. Powerful empires have crumbled into dust. Great cities have been swallowed by deserts, forests, and oceans. Yet Roanoke occupies a very different place in our imagination because it was never an empire. It was a village, a small community of ordinary people. There were no famous kings living there, no legendary generals, no enormous armies, only farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, people whose dreams look remarkably similar to our own. They hope to build homes, raise families, harvest crops, live peaceful lives. Those dreams were ordinary, and perhaps that is exactly why their disappearance still affects us. History often celebrates extraordinary individuals. Roanoke reminds us that ordinary lives matter just as much. John White's journals preserve only fragments of those lives. A few names, a handful of dates, brief descriptions. Beyond that, silence. We know Eleanor Dare existed. We know Virginia Dare was born. We know craftsmen built homes. We know children played somewhere inside the settlement. But what made them laugh? Who sang while working? Who comforted frightened neighbors during storms? Who stayed awake through long nights worrying about food? History cannot answer those questions. Not because they were unimportant, but because everyday moments rarely survive in written records. Archaeology helps fill part of that silence. A broken cooking pot reminds us that someone prepared meals there. Animal bones reveal what families hunted and ate. Fragments of clothing suggest how people dressed. Glass beads hint at trade and human relationships. Every recovered object quietly whispers the same message. Real people lived here. Real people built lives here. Sometimes visitors expect archaeology to uncover spectacular treasures, golden jewelry, ancient weapons, magnificent monuments. Roanoke offers something much simpler. Buttons, nails, ceramic fragments, rusted tools, the ordinary objects of ordinary existence. Ironically, those humble discoveries often carry the greatest emotional weight. A child's spoon, a sewing needle, a cooking vessel blackened by years of fire. These objects remind us that history is rarely made only by famous names. It is made by millions of anonymous people whose stories disappear long before historians arrive. Roanoke represents all of them. The colony also forces modern historians to think carefully about memory itself. Why do some stories survive while others vanish? Thousands of settlements existed throughout history. Most are forgotten. Roanoke endured because someone returned. John White survived. He wrote. He recorded. Without his journals, the colony might have disappeared twice. Once physically, and once for memory. That thought carries remarkable significance. History depends upon witnesses. If no one records events, if no one preserves documents, entire communities can disappear almost completely. Even today, countless archaeological sites remain unidentified simply because no written record survived. Roanoke escaped that fate by the narrowest margin. One man returned. One journal survived. One carved word remained visible. Sometimes that is enough. Another remarkable aspect of the mystery is how respectfully modern historians now approach indigenous history. Earlier generations often viewed native communities only as background figures within the Roanoke story. Today, scholars recognize that perspective was incomplete. The people living along the Carolina coast possess their own histories, traditions, governments, and complex relationships long before English ships appeared on the horizon. Understanding Roanoke requires understanding those communities as well. Increasingly, historians collaborate with indigenous descendants whose oral traditions preserve memories unavailable in European documents. These traditions do not always provide direct answers, but they offer valuable perspectives that written English records often ignored. History becomes richer when more voices are heard. Perhaps that is one of the most important lessons Roanoke teaches us. No mystery can be understood from only one point of view. Every culture remembers the past differently. Every witness notices different details. Every generation asks different questions. The lost colony has survived because historians continue listening not only to old documents, but also to archaeology, science, landscape, and memory itself. For centuries later, those voices still speak, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone willing to listen. Standing on Roanoke Island today, it is surprisingly easy to forget how isolated this place once was. Modern roads connect the Outer Banks to the mainland. Visitors arrive by car. Tourists photograph the shoreline. Museums display carefully preserved artifacts behind glass. The landscape feels peaceful, almost timeless. But beneath that quiet surface lies one of the greatest reminders of how uncertain the world once was. In the 16th century, the Atlantic Ocean was not simply a body of water. It was a barrier between two worlds. Crossing it required months. Communication was almost non-existent. A single storm could erase years of planning. The people of Roanoke understood that better than anyone. When John White sailed away in 1587, no one expected 3 years to pass before another English ship returned. The settlers probably counted the weeks, then the months. Eventually, they may have realized something no colony ever wanted to admit. No one was coming. That realization must have changed everything. At first, they likely rationed supplies carefully, expecting rescue at any moment. Then they expanded gardens, strengthened defenses, built additional structures, adapted their routines. As time passed, hope probably transformed into acceptance. England had become an idea rather than a destination. The colony could no longer survive by waiting. It had to survive by changing. This is one reason many modern historians believe the settlers eventually stopped thinking of themselves as temporary colonists. They became residents of a new land. Their future depended not upon England, but upon the relationships they built where they already lived. If that happened, then perhaps the greatest mistake is calling Roanoke the Lost Colony. Lost to whom? Certainly not to the people who live there. If they joined neighboring indigenous communities, if they raised children, if they adapted to new ways of life, then they were not lost at all. Only England lost them. History lost them. Their descendants, if they existed, would not have viewed themselves as missing. They would simply have been living their lives. This perspective changes the entire mystery. Instead of asking why the settlers disappeared, we begin asking why later generations expected them to remain exactly as they had been. Human beings change. Communities evolve. Cultures blend. That process has happened throughout history countless times. Perhaps Roanoke represents one of those moments. Not a catastrophe, but a transformation. Of course, no historian can state that with certainty. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet this interpretation explains something important. It explains why no battlefield exists, why no mass grave has ever been found, why homes were dismantled rather than destroyed, why useful possessions disappeared alongside the people. It suggests planning, adaptation, choice, not panic. Another fascinating aspect of the mystery involves memory. Imagine being one of the youngest children in the colony, perhaps only 3 or 4 years old when your family left Roanoke. Would you remember England? Probably not. Your earliest memories would belong to North America, to forests, to rivers, to unfamiliar birds, to people speaking different languages. Within a single generation, the colony's English identity may already have begun to fade. By the second generation, it might have disappeared almost completely. History often focuses on political borders and national identities. Ordinary families think differently. They think about survival, friendship, food, children, shelter. If those needs were met elsewhere, leaving Roanoke behind may not have felt like abandoning a dream. It may have felt like protecting one. There's something deeply moving about that possibility. Rather than imagining desperate victims disappearing into darkness, we can imagine determined families making the hardest decision of their lives, leaving behind homes they had built with their own hands, carrying only what they could transport, walking toward uncertainty because staying guaranteed failure. History remembers only the abandoned settlement. It does not remember the courage that decision may have required. Perhaps that courage deserves as much attention as the mystery itself. Today, school children often learn about Roanoke as an unsolved puzzle. Researchers examine maps. Television documentaries search for hidden clues. Archaeologists continue digging. All of those efforts are valuable, but perhaps the most important lesson lies somewhere else. Roanoke reminds us that history is made by ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances. Not every chapter ends with victory. Not every mystery receives an answer. Sometimes, the greatest human achievement is simply surviving long enough to begin again somewhere else. And if that is truly what happened at Roanoke, then perhaps the lost colony was never a story about disappearance. Perhaps it was always a story about resilience. As historians often say, the past rarely gives us complete stories. Instead, it leaves fragments: a broken piece of pottery, a faded journal, a weathered map, a name carved into wood. Everything else must be reconstructed with patience, evidence, and humility. Few mysteries illustrate that truth better than the lost colony of Roanoke. For more than 400 years, generations have searched for a dramatic ending: a forgotten battlefield, a hidden cemetery, a buried village, a secret document waiting inside an old archive, something that would finally allow someone to say, "This is what happened." Yet perhaps that expectation misunderstands history itself. Not every question receives a final answer. Some events disappear because the people who lived them never imagined anyone would ask about them centuries later. To the settlers, survival was far more important than leaving records for future historians. If they packed their belongings and moved south to Croton, why would they write lengthy explanations? Why would they assume that 300 or 400 years later, millions of strangers would desperately want to know where they had gone? From their perspective, the answer may have seemed obvious. We moved. Nothing more needed to be said. Ironically, what appeared obvious to them became an unsolved mystery for everyone else. History is full of similar examples. Entire families migrate without leaving documents. Villages relocate because rivers change course. Communities merge until their original identities quietly disappear. Most of the time, no one notices. Roanoke became famous only because someone came back looking. John White returned. He expected to find familiar faces. Instead, he found absence. And absence has a remarkable power over the human imagination. We often fear what we cannot explain more than what we can. That is why Roanoke continues to inspire books, documentaries, novels, films, and scientific expeditions. The mystery invites participation. Every generation believes it might finally solve the puzzle. But perhaps the greatest value of Roanoke lies not in solving it. Perhaps its greatest value lies in what it teaches about history itself. History is not a collection of perfect answers. It is an ongoing conversation between evidence and interpretation. New discoveries constantly reshape old conclusions. Ideas once accepted as fact are reconsidered. Forgotten voices return through archaeology and oral tradition. The past remains alive precisely because our understanding continues to evolve. Roanoke demonstrates that process beautifully. Early historians blame native peoples almost automatically. Modern researchers recognize the evidence for such claims as weak. Later generations imagine supernatural forces. Scientific investigation dismissed them. Today, many scholars emphasize cooperation, adaptation, and cultural integration rather than sudden destruction. The mystery has not changed. Our understanding has. That evolution reflects progress, not because we know everything, but because we have learned to ask better questions. There is another lesson hidden within Roanoke. Human resilience often leaves fewer traces than human catastrophe. Battles produce ruins. Fires leave ashes. Earthquakes destroy cities. But successful adaptation can become almost invisible. People move, build new homes, raise children, adopt new customs. Within a few generations, only faint traces remain. If Roanoke settlers survived by becoming part of another community, then their greatest success also became the reason historians struggle to find them today. They did not disappear. They changed. Perhaps that possibility is more profound than any dramatic ending, because it reminds us that survival does not always look heroic. Sometimes survival means letting go of the past, accepting a different future, beginning again under another name. History rarely celebrates those quiet victories. Yet they may be the most common victories humanity has ever achieved. For centuries later, the forests around Roanoke still whisper in the coastal wind. The tides still reshape the shoreline. The same stars that guided English ships continue crossing the night sky. Nature remembers nothing. Only people remember. And memory itself is fragile. That is why stories like Roanoke matter. Not because they provide certainty, but because they remind us how easily ordinary lives can disappear from history if no one chooses to preserve them. Every forgotten family, every unnamed child, every abandoned home carries a story worthy of being remembered. Roanoke asks us to remember even when complete answers remain beyond our reach. Perhaps that is the truest form of historical respect, not pretending to know what cannot be known, but refusing to forget those who came before us simply because history became silent. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke has endured for more than 4 centuries because it refuses to give us what we naturally seek: an ending. Most historical events eventually reach a conclusion. A battle ends with victory or defeat. An empire rises, then falls. A city is built, flourishes, and declines. History usually allows us to follow the entire journey. Roanoke is different. Its final chapter was never written. Or perhaps it was written only in the lives of people whose names quietly disappeared from the historical record. That possibility may be the most moving of all. When we picture the lost colony, it is easy to imagine a single dramatic night, a sudden disappearance, a mysterious force, an unexplained catastrophe. But history rarely unfolds that way. Real life is usually slower, more complicated, made up of countless small decisions rather than one extraordinary event. A family deciding to leave because the harvest failed, parents choosing a safer place to raise their children, neighbors agreeing to dismantle their homes and carry the timber elsewhere, friends saying goodbye to a place they had hoped would become their future. Those moments rarely appear in history books, yet they shape history far more often than spectacular events ever do. Perhaps the settlers of Roanoke never realized they were becoming part of one of history's greatest mysteries. To them, each day probably felt painfully ordinary: repairing roofs, gathering food, watching children grow, wondering whether ships from England would ever return, trying to survive one more season. If they eventually left the settlement, they may have believed they were making a practical decision, not creating a legend. The carved word Croton may have been nothing more than a simple message for John White, a direction, a promise, a reassurance. We're alive. We've moved. You'll find us there. They could never have imagined that storms would prevent them from following, that centuries would pass, that millions of people around the world would study those 8 letters, searching for hidden meanings they themselves never intended. History has a remarkable way of transforming ordinary moments into extraordinary mysteries. Today, most professional historians lean toward a conclusion that is both simple and profoundly human. The colonists likely survived for some time after John White's departure. Facing drought, isolation, and the certainty that no rescue had arrived, they probably chose to relocate. Some may have joined the Croton people. Others may have traveled farther inland. Families may have separated. Communities may have merged. Over generations, their descendants became part of a changing world where old identities slowly disappeared. If that interpretation is correct, then the lost colony was never truly lost. It simply stopped existing as an English colony. Its people became something new, and perhaps there is something beautiful about that idea. History often remembers kingdoms, governments, wars, but ordinary people survive by adapting, by changing, by building new lives when old ones become impossible. Roanoke may represent one of history's greatest examples of that quiet resilience. Even if we never recover every answer, the search itself has value. Every archaeological excavation teaches us something about early colonial life. Every newly analyzed document deepens our understanding of the 16th century. Every scientific discovery reminds us that history is never completely finished. There will always be new questions, new evidence, new perspectives. And perhaps that is why Roanoke continues to matter. Not because it is unsolved, but because it reminds us that history is not simply a collection of dates and names. It is the story of human beings, people who dreamed, people who feared, people who loved their families enough to cross an unknown ocean in search of a better future. Whether those dreams ended in tragedy or quietly continued in another place, we may never know, but we do know this. For more than 400 years, the people of Roanoke have refused to disappear completely. Their homes are gone. Their voices are silent. Their final footsteps have long since faded beneath forests, tides, and shifting sands. Yet their story endures, not because history solved their mystery, but because history chose to remember that they once existed. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory memory can offer. If you enjoyed uncovering one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we explore forgotten people, remarkable events, and incredible true stories that shaped our world, but somehow slipped to the pages of history. Because sometimes, the stories history almost forgot are the ones most worth remembering.